Okay, in this video we're going to have a look at how to interpret aerial photography, and this can apply to general aerial photos that maybe have been possibly supplied from a Google Earth screenshot, a vertical aerial photo. It also helps if you are looking at orthophotos, which are vertical aerial photos that have your topographic symbols superimposed over the photo. But also if we are looking at our photographs that have been taken at an oblique angle, so your high oblique or low oblique, that gives us more detail. But a lot of the rules of interpreting a photo still apply. So when you're looking at a photograph, there's various factors or elements that we can use to recognize various features. And those factors are things that we need to consider to try and interpret what we're looking at from above. We're very used to looking at our environment in a horizontal view. We know what the shape of a tree looks like in a horizontal view, but we're not often used to seeing what the world looks like from above. And so we need to use these various clues to tell us what and to try and interpret what we are actually looking at. And the clues that we're going to look at are what various shapes mean, and certain shapes will lend themselves more to certain types of features. We're going to look at how patterns can influence what we're looking at. The size of objects will indicate various kinds of use. Shadows can give us clues as to what we're looking at. We're going to consider the concept of tone, which is how dark or light the features are being represented based on how the light is being reflected off of them. And we're also going to consider the concept of texture, so whether something looks smooth or rough. And that will then indicate what we're actually looking at. So for each of these examples, you have a Google Earth aerial photograph, and we're going to find all the examples and highlight all the examples on them. So I would recommend that you print these in black and white, and then you can use highlighters to basically annotate these notes and show yourself all these various examples. So the first example we're going to try and investigate is the element of size and shape. So when we're looking at the size of an object, it will always help us to tell us what we're actually looking at. The smaller the object, obviously the less we can use that land, because it's taking up less land. And so what I mean by that is that these buildings are much smaller compared to these buildings here. And so these are definitely going to be residential or possibly office, maybe not offices, they look more like a complex, okay? And so it's residential land use. Because the size of the actual building is so much smaller, we can assume that people are actually living there. Whereas in this example, this is a massive roof structure. It's really large. So we can assume that this is not someone's home, okay? That then shows us how the size indicates the kind of size of dwelling or use of building. And so this is definitely a shopping center. The reason I say this is a shopping center as opposed to a factory, the big clue is you need to look for a parking lot. So when there is a parking lot, in fact, this is actually an office block. But in this case, here's your shopping center with all of the roof coverings over that kind of strip mall. And there's your actual car park for the patrons that are visiting. This one here being an office block, you can actually see that there is car park facilities here with shade cloth, okay? And then you can see the large structure of the building, obviously covering the offices all under kind of one roof. So always consider how big something is and then link that to how it would be used and the logical way in which that building would be used. Okay. We then can consider the shape in terms of whether it's a regular or irregular shape. So the more regular a shape, all right, so if I've got straight lines like this, and I've got kind of very circular, angular shapes, then we say that those are regular and they are often man-made features. Man-made features take on those very regular, angular features and shapes. If something is more natural, then it's going to follow less of a regular shape. it's not going to really have a shape to it. So you might find like this land use over here, it's not a great color, but this land use is showing the sort of green belt, or this is actually a golf course, but it's got more of an irregular shape to it, kind of conforming to the relief or the shape of the land, as opposed to a set structure or building that can take on more of a rectangular, regular shape. Something else to consider is in terms of identifying the difference between roads and railways. We can see often that our roads are going to be of a certain width depending on the lanes. So we can actually see the type of road. Okay, if you zoom in here, these little side roads are really small, whereas these are much wider, and that then shows us that that is a highway with lots of lanes, okay, as opposed to a little secondary or other road within the suburbs. You can see they're much more narrow. Your roads actually are also going to be quite broad compared to a railway line. So there isn't a railway line in this example. We'll look for one in another photograph. But the railway line is a single line, and that would be quite, because you don't need to have lanes for cars, you know, oncoming on traffic or anything like that. You've just got that single line. And so that's generally quite thin in terms of what you're looking at. And railways are not going to make loops like this, okay? Trains don't like to go in loops and angles, so you're going to find your railways are very straight, all right? And if they do, that's actually a bit of a sharp bend. But if they do have to do a curve, they're going to make that curve quite wide to ensure that it really minimizes the loops that need to be made. So the more loopy, the more chance it is that it is a road that you're looking at and not a railway. Okay. You can also obviously assume that rivers are going to follow a bit more of an irregular shape. They're going to be very sort of natural in terms of how it loops, and not that regular road shape that you would expect from man-made infrastructure. So if we have a look here for the example of the railways, you can actually see it's quite thick in this region because this is a station, a railway station. So here you can see all the trains are lined up, okay? We've got the entire station where they're all collected and kind of parking, and there's that Nelson Mandela Bridge going over into our inner city. But that can show us, if we look and zoom in, what the width of one of those roads might actually look, railways. So the railway line for one train is that width, compared to the road over here that crosses over, where it is much wider because it's got to make way for various lanes to cross. Okay, so that just shows the actual width between a railway line and identifying a railway line versus a road. What you can also see here quite nicely is the use of land in terms of within the CBD, the big buildings, okay, huge roofs, all right. But what we can also see is that there's a big difference between the skyscrapers that are sitting on the sort of southeast corner here, these big office blocks taking up an entire block, but vertically those buildings will be really tall. So they are obviously maximizing their space. It's cheaper to build up rather than building horizontally. Next to that, however, we've got an indication or example of industry. Okay, so you can see here the kind of layout of your more of a factory layout, where you've got that wide roof, lots of area of land being used. But we know it's not a shop because there isn't actually a parking lot integrated into this region. So this is one whole area that, you know, workers could park there, but you don't need lots of patrons coming to the region. Okay. So just showing the different shapes, you can see the shapes are very regular as well. So all very man-made within our city. You've got those roads coming into the city, and just the various kind of regular shapes making this very built-up urbanized region. In contrast, we've got a little bit more in terms of natural versus the urban and built up, and the shape changes that come with that. So here you can actually see the river, and the way we see that river is that darker line, and often there's a tree line that follows along so that you can see where that river is. So if we follow, and try to follow with your eyes so that you can see and highlight it on your example, the river more easily. But have a look at that irregular shape, okay? It's quite natural, as opposed to the very straight lines of the roads. We make our roads quite straight, obviously helping in terms of navigation, but also in terms of just building on that flat land and laying out our settlement in an organized way. So you've got that very straight man-made feature versus the natural features surrounding it. You can see the difference in the size of the buildings as well from above. This obviously indicating some kind of shopping center or office block, whereas smaller roofs adjacent would be individual homes, okay, with a much smaller floor plan. Okay, you can see where possibly it's a complex, where there's lots of the same kind of roof. Often the roofs are joined because the houses are connected. They have shared walls, okay, between them. So then you could actually see where there is a complex versus an individual home on their own, okay. So these are the kinds of things you need to look for. You can also see an example of a school here. So here we have the big, long, extensive roof of a connected classroom, okay, all the way across. And the reason we know that this is a school is adjacent, you've got school fields, you've got your tennis courts, your netball courts. So you use your surrounding evidence to help you to identify what the objects are that you are looking at. Okay, let's have a look at pattern. So pattern is basically how features are arranged with reference to each other. So you could have a tree or forest, okay, having a very different kind of pattern. A natural forest will have a very different pattern to a plantation, because that has naturally kind of occurred and grown and is irregular, and there's going to be areas that are going to kind of have a patchy region within that dense growth, and so that creates more of a natural pattern. Whereas here you can see that the trees have actually got more of a regular pattern, and that's because it's being grown in rows like this as individual trees, giving more of that striped appearance, okay, as opposed to the more natural kind of irregular pattern of that woodland. The other thing that we want to consider is that your trees are going to have a very different pattern to vineyards, okay? If we have a look at the vineyards, you don't have an individual feature or vegetation feature from above. Here I can see the tree there is its kind of individual spotted appearance in those rows. Whereas with vineyards, because they are planted along almost like a washing line, the plant grows connected, and so the pattern is a very singular stripe across the land. And that then, if you learn that stripe shows a vineyard, you'll be able to then identify a vineyard versus a woodland area or cultivated area where there might be more individual plants, or orchards where there are individual trees. We can also see where the land has been recently ploughed here, okay? There's bare soil, okay? It's a lighter tone because the light is reflecting off of that sand, as opposed to where there is vegetation over here where it's darker because that light is being absorbed into the vegetation and not reflecting off of the soil, the bare soil. So there's a darker tone here and a lighter tone there. So this is the kinds of patterns that you need to try and identify in terms of vegetation. Here you can see again trees because of that individual pattern of the actual individual plant. Okay, then what we're having a look at here in terms of pattern is the layout of the actual settlement pattern. So the houses are dispersed across this landscape. So then you consider your settlement patterns and how the actual layout or the position of the buildings in relation to each other. So we can see here is a house, there is a house, okay, there is a house, and they are dispersed from each other. If we had to zoom out, we might say that these are all part of a village that is concentrated and more nucleated together across that landscape, even though the individual houses seem dispersed from each other. It's all got to do with scale and the scale at which that photo has then been captured and how you interpret that pattern. Whereas here you can see in contrast, the houses are much closer to each other, so they have a more nucleated pattern because they have been arranged in a more clustered form in relation to each other. So that's bringing in our settlement patterns, and again, even making it more nucleated in our urban areas. You can see how densely packed all of that built up area is, and those individual houses being right on top of each other. Okay, and that's showing quite a dense nucleation. The other thing to consider in terms of our pattern is we can also see in terms of land use how those buildings have been arranged, and whether, like when we looked at it as opposed to a complex or an individual home, the differences in how those buildings are actually laid out. Now we're going to have a look at the concept of tone, and tone is basically the shading or how dark or light that feature actually presents in the photograph. It all has to do with how the light hits the surface and really the albedo of that surface. So if you've got a darker surface, we know that our insulation is going to be absorbed quite a lot by that surface and very little is going to be reflected. But if you have a lighter surface, so say for instance here you've got that lighter or white surface like snow, you're going to then increase the amount that is being reflected and decrease the amount that's being absorbed. So not as much as being absorbed, but lots is going to be reflected. So that's going to be that higher albedo. Let's just summarize that. Okay, and this is the low albedo effect. And really that helps in terms of how we see the actual land, from whether it's a light surface or a dark surface, and what kind of feature we could expect would absorb or would reflect. So like I've said already, in this example, the bare soil is representing a high albedo because the insulation is hitting that surface, reflecting off the soil particles, and really just representing a very light tone in this photograph. It's easier obviously to also see in a black and white image because you can see the different shades of grey. And so you've got that bare ground reflecting light and becoming a lighter tone. Here where the vegetation is missing, you can see it's a lighter tone as opposed to the darker tone that is being represented by the dense vegetation. I'm just going to make this a bit darker. By the dense vegetation that's right next to it. So when we have a lot of foliage, that is going to increase the amount of light that's absorbed, and therefore less is reflected, and so it gives off a darker tone. So that's that dense vegetation. Often we can see it in our mature crops, that darker appearance, and more irregular surfaces. Okay, your regular surfaces are going to take on more of a lighter tone. So here you can see again with this, the road as an example, it's also quite a smooth surface, and the light is not going to then be scattered in all sorts of directions. It's going to actually then allow for a lighter tone to be reflected back up. So the one thing that we need to consider in this example is the water. And water behaves differently because here we are talking about a transparent feature. And so this dam here is appearing very dark in tone. And the reason for that is because the water is actually very clean. So the light is able to penetrate into the water very deep and doesn't then reflect off of those molecules and disperses deep into that mass. So when water is clean, it's going to have a darker tone, and that is because of the fact that the water is clear, so it's got a lower turbidity. If our water was dirty, I'll show you another example of that, then what will happen is that the sediment particles in the water, so if there's a high suspension and a high turbidity, the light will actually, if you imagine that this little, let's just draw it in here, if you've got a water mass like this, and you've got those lots of suspension particles in the water, the light then is going to reflect off of those particles, and that then means that it isn't penetrating deep in there into the depths of the water, appearing darker on the surface. So because we're reflecting the light back up, this feature is then going to appear to be much lighter in tone, and we can say that the water is not clean potentially, but rather dirty or has a higher turbidity. So here's a great example of the differences in the water. So in the first one above, this dam, the water is clean because we can see that it is very dark. It's not reflecting that light. Whereas in this example, the water is actually appearing to be very light in tone, and to the point where it almost just looks like land. It doesn't seem to be water, and that's because it's got such a high turbidity. There's so many suspended solids in that water that the light is being reflected off of that surface and making it a much lighter tone. So you can see extensive farming here as well. You can see the pattern of the strips, okay, in which the farm has been laid out, the actual crops, all right? But you can still actually see a little bit of a dotted appearance. If we look at some of the newer established land, might be because it's not so, it's a bit pixelated. I would say this is probably more cultivated land as opposed to vines, because you can almost see the dotted appearance of individual plants, but it's not a very clear example. Okay, here the kind of individual farmhouse, just thinking about dwellings and how they are different compared to like a complex and estate here, where you've got individual houses but in a neat kind of regular pattern. You've got much smaller buildings dotted in between as well. You've got the regular rows happening here in terms of whether those are polytunnels, okay, growing underneath that shade cloth. Right, and then over here we can consider tone and shade again, because you can see the lighter appearance here of the water, even though that water is relatively clean, just compared to the darker vegetation that surrounds it. So you've got that pattern of the patchworked pattern of the cultivated land, the commercial farming either side of the river on the banks, and then you've got the actual water where that flows between. You've also got that kind of more irregular shape of the branches of the water, okay, as opposed to the more regular lines of the cultivated fields. So just looking at what is man-made, what is natural. Here obviously you have your circular fields for cultivation, and the type of irrigation is different on those circular fields as opposed to your square fields. And so what we can say is, because it's circular, it's using something called a pivoted irrigation. So the irrigation is in the middle and it turns around, okay? Whereas here you're going to have big rows of irrigation line on wheels that will roll over the field, okay, as opposed to pivoting around on a circular center. Right, now we can also see the example here is showing the difference between areas that are bare ground, okay, that have just been plowed, or bare, they've just been harvested, sorry, And then you've got your vegetation, where the vegetation still exists with the foliage, where it's a darker tone. So just comparing, is it new land? Is it old land? Is it newly established land? Is it old land that has lots of foliage? Has it been harvested recently? Has it not been harvested recently? How mature are the crops? Are they new crops? Are they mature? Are they ready to be harvested? Obviously, the darker it is, the more foliage there is, the more mature. If it's quite sparse, you can see in this area, it possibly is newer crops because there isn't that dense foliage filling the spaces. Right, then we can have a look at our examples of texture, and texture really is can be defined as whether a surface is represented as smooth or is it rough. Okay, is it giving an appearance of being very coarse, or is it very even and smooth? All right. And so we can use the words, really the most common words that we use is smooth and rough textures, and that then helps us to also interpret what type of land we're looking at. How has it been cultivated? Is it crops? Is it vineyards? Are we looking at forests? And it's all got to do with how smooth it is or how speckled it is. How much foliage is there? Like I was saying with the shade and the tone, because of the way the light is, it also gives off a different texture, whether it is more rough or whether it is more smooth. So here, with our cultivated land, you can see that the crops have a much more speckled appearance, even though they're in those strips, those lines that they've been planted in. It's kind of still got that kind of speckled appearance between the crops. The plowed fields obviously look very striped. They're darker, the lines in between, okay, also got to do with the reflection of light between vegetation in the row versus the actual exposed soils. You can see those very defined lines, and when you see those lines like that, you know that the land is being cultivated because of those plow lines. You could say that this kind of gives quite a rough texture in a way, even though the pattern is very regular, because it is giving that alternating appearance between the darker and the lighter features. And if we want to look at an orchard from above, remember that orchards are our fruit trees. So there you can see that the orchard is definitely very grid-like in its texture and very coarse. So I say grid-like because trees are kind of planted in rows, but each of those rows would then help to create a column. And so in the end, you have quite a grid of cells or individual trees making up that orchard. So it looks quite grid-like, and certainly a very coarse texture again as well, so rough, coarse texture. Here, just natural trees growing, you could say that that's a rough, coarse texture as well, as opposed to the bare ground that surrounds it, giving more of a smooth a texture. So just in comparison, again, your clean water versus dirty water, consider the tone, the darker tone, the lighter tone, and how that all works. Right, here's an example of vineyards. They are going to have a finer texture, very fine compared. Here you can see it's almost as if they're thicker because the trees are obviously bigger, and there you can see those stripes are much thicker. Whereas in this example with the vineyards, they're thinner because the vines grow on very thin kind of lines across, and they're striped, and you don't really have that grid-like look because they're all going to be connected and grow along the line, making these stripes. Okay, again, looking at examples of tone with our dams, our natural features versus our man-made features. You can see the nice row of trees being planted here as opposed to the natural trees in this section. So you really can easily compare the various elements and try and interpret what you're actually looking at by looking at those clues. In this example, we're looking at a plantation. So again, you're going to see the trees that are being planted across the landscape. You've got the outline of the roads, making it more regular, and so we know that this is not just natural bush, as in the last example where you could just see natural kind of woodland growing. Whereas here, there are neat kind of lots or plots of land that are being used, and it's got a really quite a kind of mottled appearance. Mottled meaning you've got areas that are kind of dense and then some areas that are quite sparse. So mottled is like kind of a spotty appearance. And we also can consider where you have younger plantations versus older, more mature, because where there's more dense vegetation, it's older, okay? And where it is obviously sparse is where there's very young trees growing that haven't actually been able to grow enough foliage. So you can look at the age. You can be asked questions about interpreting the age of a plantation in various sections. Right, now we're going to look at the example of using shadows to actually interpret what we're looking at. And the first thing we need to consider is that shadows will obviously, all objects cast a shadow. But we need to consider that shadows can come from mountains, but they can also come from the sides of a depression, of a hole, okay? So you can have a mountain shadow, but you can also have a hole creating a shadow from the actual slopes within it. So there's shadows being cast, and this entire feature is the hole, and the light is hitting this feature, and obviously the shadow is being cast on the inside over here. And so that gives us an indication that we're looking at an excavation in this region. If we have a look at the mountains here, that can help us to indicate, the shadows can help us to see how high the feature is. So here's your ridge line, okay, going out at Harty, surrounding the Hartbeespoort Dam. And I can see that the slopes here, firstly, the slopes that are sitting on this side, okay, if I zoom out a bit just to see it more easily, these slopes are actually quite steep, all right? Okay, there, that's working. Because the actual shadow is quite wide. So you can see that that indicates the height of the slope based on the shadow that is being cast off of that slope. So all along that ridge, we can see the shadow being cast, and that shows us the height of the actual mountain, all right? Then, in this example, we can actually get an indication of very tall, thin features that we wouldn't actually easily see. If you just look at a dot from above, you wouldn't know that it's actually a pole and that you're looking at it from above. So in this example, you can see that because it's at a little bit more of an oblique angle, but we can see the perfect layout of those shadows showing us more of the shape. So there's the pole, and then its shadow that's coming off of it can help us to see firstly its height, but not only its height, we can also get a sense then, because from above we would just see a circle of the feature, but the shadow is actually helping to show us the shape of that feature as well. So that gives us really good clues as to what we are actually looking at, because we're used to seeing the feature from the side, and so we'll be more familiar with the shadow shape. And in this example, the shadows are being cast at a certain orientation. So this is how you can actually work out the time of day. What you need to remember for this is that when our sun shines, if we've got a feature on the ground, okay, the feature is going to cast a shadow always depending on where the sun is. So if the sun is in this direction and shines on the object, the shadow is going to be cast behind. Okay, and if the sun is positioned and moves in the sky to this position, the shadow will then change its position to this side. Okay, so what we can do is we can then relate this to knowing that the sun rises in the east, moves up in the day, and is usually overhead at 12 noon, and then starts to set in the west. So if the photograph is showing shadows that are pointing to the southwest, we know that the sun was actually in the east at that time. And so this is a morning photo. Okay. If the shadows are pointing to the southeast, then the photograph was taken with the sun in the west. And so that then means that it is an afternoon photo. And if there are no shadows or hardly any shadows, we know that then the photo was taken when the sun was directly above, and so no shadow really is being cast. So that can give you an indication of the time of day. So let's apply that to this photograph. Always find your biggest roofs, your features that possibly are really large, that will give us the biggest shadows to actually use as a reference. So these really tall buildings are a great example. Here we have the actual building. Okay, there's another example, and there. And then the shadow that is being cast off of it is this. So now we look at those shadows and we say, which direction are they actually pointing? Are they pointing to the southwest, or are they pointing to the southeast? Okay, and we can see that they are certainly pointing to the southwest. So if they're pointing to the southwest, we know the sun had to be in the opposite direction over here, and so it's a morning photograph. And you can see the shadows are quite consistent. If you look at the shadows coming off of the trees, I mean, it's late morning because they're kind of going straight towards where the orientation would be for 12 noon. But there you can see those shadows coming off each of those features and going towards the southwest.